All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for our fourth episode here of The Empowered Defender. Today, we're going to be talking about enhancing cybersecurity stack cohesion through integration capabilities. Today with us, we have JR and Dan, who are going to be talking a little bit about their purview of what that looks like as far as all of these solutions, how we can best kind of get some integrations going that are going to be most effective to consolidate that data and make the team more effective. And not only what integrations might be good, but what integrations we might avoid. Before we get into it, I want to pass it around the horn, pass it over to JR. JR, thank you so much for taking some time out and joining us today.
Thanks, Thomas.
Do you mind giving our audience a little overview of who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a multi-company CISO now. I've been doing this for 20, 25 years. I've worked formerly at Micron Technology and at Darktrace. Now I work for an organization called Aura, a consumer-focused digital safety company.
Fantastic. Look forward to getting into the meat with you today. Dan, obviously our CEO here at Darklight. I'll pass it over to you for a brief intro and we'll go from there.
I don't think intro is necessary, Thomas, but JR, really glad to have you here. You're, of course, underselling yourself. Micron is a CISO, very large company. You also have the experience of being on the vendor side, so you've kind of experienced the pain that we're going through as a startup, although Darktrace is certainly no startup anymore. So really happy that you gave your time to us today to help us through this. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Dan. Happy to be here.
Well, gentlemen, let's get into it. Everyone, thank you again for joining us. As we're going through today, we do have the chat section open. Feel free and drop in any questions and we'll get to them either as we're going through live or we actually have a Q&A section set at the end, depending on the conversation track. We've covered our backgrounds. With that being it, I think I'll just open it up with some dialogue around a question and we'll continue to dig in from there. So JR, Dan, what are the main challenges in managing multiple cybersecurity tools?
Well, if you don't mind me starting on this one, JR, and then I'll maybe try to refine the question for you to take over. And again, it's great to have someone with your diverse background on this call, because a lot of the people that watch now or watch this in video are coming at things from different perspectives. And from a CISO perspective or CISO perspective on or whomever is being responsible for the cybersecurity of an organization, or perhaps you're an MSP or an MSSP, that you have to work with lots of different types of tools, and you have a good and bad appreciation for the various tools out there. And as I like to say, the silos of information that are available, because you have been on the client side and a buyer of these products, but also very instrumental in helping communicate into the Darktrace company on what it's like to be on the client side. But then you got to see the vendor side of how it's harder than it may look for a vendor to actually work with these other tool sets. So maybe just a big picture, 30,000 foot level, and how you look at that and how your experience going from a CISO of a large company like Micron into a vendor and now back to enterprise, how your views have changed or not changed.
Yeah, it's true. I've been a customer and a very large buyer. I've been on the vendor side and customer success and partnerships, and then I advise some VC funds today and work with a lot of their portfolio companies. And this issue is definitely two-sided. From a buyer's perspective, the fantastic market that we have around startups and people, founders like yourself, spotting ideas, building up a capability around it is really powerful. And we see a lot of startups in the cybersecurity industry. As a buyer, that's great. It helps me solve a problem, but then I've got 19 other problems to solve. And does that mean 19 tools? And sometimes it does. And if you're on the vendor side, you have to be thinking about integrations and how you integrate and who you integrate with could be an expensive decision. because now you've got to fund that, you've got to put manpower behind it, you've got to maintain some continuity of that integration being maintained going forward. On the buyer side, of course, I want everything to be integrated, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And if it's not, then I'm left with a decision of, do I build a custom integration? And that can be an expensive decision, because I might be able to get exactly what I want, but then the person that I hired to build that integration, they might go on to their next gig. Now I'm left with a broken tool, and I'm not getting the data flow that I need to get. And now it's an expensive decision, because when I backfill that role, I've also got to pay attention to the right skill sets to maintain these custom integrations. And it gets exponentially more difficult the more tools, the more sprawl, the more silos that you have in place. And so it's I think a problem on both sides of the table. It's not easy to solve. I think that's why you see platforms making such an impact, because if they can solve the problem for you, then that brings additional value to the table. But this integrations thing, I think it's a tough nut to crack for sure.
Thanks for that, JR, and apologies, I got caught into a hotel, so if there's background noise, my apologies for this webinar. So, one of the things that and I will be careful, because we are about ready to go out on the VC circuit for our next round of funding, so I don't want to offend the people I'll be pitching. But in different think tank that I'm involved with, and we had a VC community come in, I sort of pointed the finger at them, the cybersecurity VC in general, as being part of the problem on why we have so many tools. And the theory here is that in order to get money from a VC, it's easier to say, we're going to attack this problem. So phishing, we're going to attack this phishing problem because we know it's a problem. It's easy to understand if we just attack the one thing, but then that creates a silo, which is why companies of your size and larger have on average at least 71 different tools in their environment, which you say gets very, very difficult to manage. So now that you're also looking in the VC community, we're going to come back to more the practitioner, but since you brought up VC, I'd just love to get your take on that. And are you seeing that even the creativity of some of the brilliant sort of cyber technologists out there that want to fuse this stuff together, but when you start to fuse this stuff, it's such a complex problem. Sometimes the less sophisticated VC just kind of loses it, and we're not letting these technologists that may not be the best storytellers get through that and get funded that could really make a difference. So what's your take on that?
I think it happens because, to your point, that the VC folks, they're not necessarily the cyber experts, and we don't want them to be. We want them to be financial experts. And so they like to see a really clear, especially in early stages, a really clear problem definition and solution. And here's a person that's bringing that idea that has demonstrated experience in that space. That makes a nice, crisp investment opportunity, because as a non-practitioner, I can see that, or make a determination that founder knows what they're doing and is likely to be successful. But if that founder, especially a first-time founder, is coming to the table with this broad vision that's going to take 10 years to execute, that's a lot harder investment decision to make. And so it brings a ton more risk to the table. And so as an early seed around, I may not want that level of risk. So if you're the practitioner, you would like, I think, to solve the world's problems. You've got to focus. And often the practitioner doesn't have the marketing experience or the storytelling experience. They don't know necessarily even all of the CISO pain points, but they have their one area that they've got expertise in and they've got a fantastic idea for. And so we want them to execute on that. And so I think that's the way that at least in the Western economy, the way that we've put together funding and VC funding, I think it does drive a lot of these very small niche startups where sometimes the exit path is get acquired. Like, we're not even going to try to go IPO. We just want to get big enough to get bought by somebody bigger.
So when you look strategically, so when you just came into your newer job, when you think of these idea of 71 tools, don't need to know how many you have, but that's the average for a medium to large company. What are sort of your big 3 or 5 or the ones you're like, look, I've got to have a proven piece here that I know has a certain amount of integration. So how do you even start that now that you have the experience of being at a very large firm like Micron, and then a very large, financially at least, valuation-wise, successful startup like Darktrace, how was that when you first came into your new position? How did that impact your decisioning on what tool set to bring on?
I think both at a Fortune 200 as well as a mid-stage startup, the question is first visibility for me. Like all of my other justifications and use cases around funding, it's going to come back to, can we define the problem? And so that's starts with visibility. And companies are all different levels of their journey along with how to get that visibility. If you're already a customer of an Office 365 or Google Workspace, you can get a lot of data just from your collaboration platforms. But extending beyond that, then to get to internet traffic and conversations from workstations to the cloud, that's a gold mine. If you can understand what your workstations are doing out there, you can tell if they've been compromised, if they got malware, if they're leaking intellectual property. So that's, I think, an early focus area for me. And given lessons that I've learned along the way, it's got to be visibility first. And to this whole point about integrations, I can get internet visibility, but that doesn't give me necessarily what's happening with inter-cloud file transfers. And so I need a different set of visibilities there, and then I need something else for email, and on and on and on. And so that's where you quickly get to maybe 5 or 6 key tools, to your point. But for me, it starts with visibility, because I can start using that data then to define how big of a problem I really have or don't have. And then that alters my strategy for phase 2 and phase 3.
So when you start from that point, especially because we do often have smaller or medium business watchers of the webinar, when you get that type of visibility, we've worked with larger organizations, Fortune 200, as you mentioned, they have a staff that can, in theory, filter through all the visibility. And I'd love to hear sort of how you look at that, meaning, like, I've been into a SOC of a company you all would have heard of, and they had one of the visibilities was related to phishing, coincidentally, and there was just sort of this clear without ever looking, because they're just so overwhelmed with false positives, or it just became noise. So how do you start attacking? Because in my opinion, in the industry, we've got plenty of available tools to provide visibility. It's just now, what do I do with that data to truly fuse it? So how are you attacking that?
Yeah. It's going to be, I think, different for every organization, depending on the maturity level that the team is at, or the cybersecurity capability, as well as the skills and the talent available on the team. And so I would say for smaller teams, or if you're kind of earlier in that journey, there's going to be too much data. There's going to be too many incidents. You can't address them all. So you pick and choose on which ones are going to have the most impact, the greatest risk, the biggest problem for me if something goes really sideways. And I'm going to kind of draw a line and think of the iceberg under the level of under the surface of the water. I'm going to focus on the biggest and highest risk issues first, and I'm going to solve those. And if those are all done and we've got time at the end of the day, then let's go back and get the next highest one. But small teams and underskilled teams just have a real challenge, because even if they got the top 5, number 6 could really be a problem, and we just may never get to it because we've just got too much on the plate. What you will see from, I think, more mature teams, certainly larger and better funded teams, is an anomaly approach, which is to say, I know I'm going to get.
We lost JR, it looks like. There he goes. Okay.
Sorry.
So you just ended at a larger team, and so start from that point.
A larger team
for an anomaly.
Better funded is going to be working off anomalies as opposed to just every event that comes in. And the way that you get there is through automation. which often means integrations. But if I know I'm going to get an HR team member that's sending a social security number through email because they're hiring, I don't want that to set off a flag every week for my security team. So I'm going to automate the response to that. I want to collect it. I want the data. I want to know that it happened, but it doesn't need a response. So I'm going to automate that. But if somebody else in the organization sends a credit card number that doesn't normally send one, then I want to know about that because I've got PCI responsibilities, whatever. So I want to start flagging those things that are anomalous and automate the things that regularly happen every day that create noise, but don't necessarily mean that something bad is happening.
So two things on that, and Thomas brought up a slide that talks about risk, and this is a big one to us. Risk equals impact times likelihood. And so, with the organizations that's sort of larger and more mature than yours, or as yours, you can kind of utilize the visibility you mentioned to get a better equation, meaning fill in the variables of the likelihood and impact, perhaps better than less funded organizations from a cyber perspective. So from a basic fundamental perspective, if you are thinking from small, medium business, and then going up to the larger ones where you can, start to have significant investments in tools, what are sort of the fundamentals on answering that question that Thomas has up, risk equals likelihood times impact, in your experience and how you do it, with what you can share?
Depending on the type of business, and often in most businesses, the intellectual property and the data is going to be an asset that has some value. To the extent that you can understand that value, that starts to influence the impact side of this equation. If I have an insider threat and somebody is going to put a bunch of documents on a USB drive, the type of documents matter. If it's the cafeteria lunch menu, yeah, I don't really care. That has a very low impact. If it's the plans for our next product release, that may have more of an impact just because it's more valuable to the company. There's more harm to be done should that be disclosed. Therefore, the impact side of the equation goes up, the risk score goes up. The likelihood for data transfers, especially for someone who's been doing this for a while, is almost always high, right? People are going to transfer data. Humans are trying to get their job done. So your likelihood is for data transfers is kind of always going to be high. So you start looking at, well, can I put in some preventative controls? Can I turn off USB ports on the laptop? If I can, then that brings my likelihood down of that particular avenue. And so that's how we kind of use this equation as we put together a strategy and a roadmap for addressing business risk, which is where a CISO wants to be, and ensuring that the next dollar that we spend is going to the next greatest business risk, bringing those down appropriately, not necessarily to zero, but bringing them down within the business's appetite.
So I'd love you to expand on one piece of this from an industry perspective. It's about visibility and knowledge or understanding of what a risk or issue may be within your organization or others. And specifically, I mean, one of the reasons that we are doing Darklight and created CIO was the idea that, hey, take just vulnerability management. And this is changing quickly. There's lots of great firms doing this. We think we're one of them. But vulnerability management in the old days being like 2 years ago, you would do a scan of vulnerabilities to see how many CVEs you have in your environment. And those CVEs are given a score. And basically, whoever has the highest score or whatever asset or device has the most CVEs at the highest score, that's the one you go pick. And that was the way to do it. Certainly 5 years ago, even for larger firms, but even 2 years ago, basically, and even to some degree, it's still very, very common now. But now that we have better understanding of that risk equation, and like what CIO is doing is it's enriching that one score with other information, threat intelligence about that particular piece of malware or that exploit on how exploitable is it? Is it known to be being exploited? If it is being exploited, by what adversary? Because those adversaries will likely have a specific type of target they're going after. So just additional enrichment capability to further in on that likelihood, because I think the National Vulnerability Database has over 220,000 CVs in it, and there's thousands every single year that come in. It's updated every 4 hours. And so when you think of this, we call it, it's not like we created this term, but vulnerability whack-a-mole. And so this gets in this idea of something we believe strongly in. It's almost better to know you have bad security than have a false sense of good security. And so we've come across these clients that are using, even if it's a good vulnerability scanner, which there's a lot that aren't good, they're getting this data and they're just doing their best by trying to chase all the CVSS scores of 8 and above or whatever, and there's just no chance.
Yeah.
So talk us through how you've addressed that problem, and you're sort of a cloud-only type environment, I believe. I don't want to share too much, but how have you addressed that, and what sort of opinions and advice would you give to others that are trying to create their tool stack on understanding things like that?
So I think this is an absolutely a maturity curve that most organizations will go through. And I've built a number of programs now. I've seen this repeatedly. All my peers that I talk to go through the same journey. If you're doing any kind of software development at all, you're going to have like vulnerabilities, because you probably have humans writing that code, or maybe now you have AI writing that code. Either way, you get errors. So if you build code, there will be bugs, there will be errors. And once you start doing your own vulnerability scan, whether it's on your software, or it's on the stack and the systems that you've deployed to run the business, there will be vulnerabilities. There will be thousands of vulnerabilities, depending on the size of your environment. And to your point, it's whack-a-mole, and it's difficult to understand which risk is a higher risk. When you've got, even if you draw the line at a CVSS score of 8, that's still a big percentage. That's still more maybe than you have staff to go deal with. And if you're not putting any preventative controls in place, even if you go close that one, your team is just going to create another one through, not by intention nor fault of their own. It's just how things happen. So I think the exploitability, and certainly I think the industry is coming around to this, some people earlier than others, to say, look, we should understand, back to the risk, like what is the real likelihood? I get that we've got 10 systems with a heartbleed vulnerability, but they all sit in a segmented network that's never going to see traffic from the outside. So the exploitability is down quite a ways. So I'm not going to fix those today. I'm going to fix something else that's publicly exposed, that's a real problem, and could be a real problem as soon as somebody runs across it. So as organizations mature and come around to this application of exploitability to understand the true risk or residual risk, then that starts to shape where we spend our time. And then as we look for additional data feeds to layer on top of that, that initial vulnerability, we start with a CVE score, and then we get exploitability. Maybe we get, if it's being actively exploited in the wild, you start getting some other feeds laid in there, and you start to get a much richer picture of where I should really focus my time first. And the sad story is that there's going to be, I like to use the cafeteria lunch menu as an example of a low value asset, and it's going to have a vulnerability that's informational, and it's never going to be fixed. And we all just get comfortable with that because we've got good intelligence on what really matters. And that's what the business needs. That's what the organization needs in terms of where we spend our time.
Yeah, and that's an interesting philosophical one, because that's also the story that, hey, we just don't have time to fix the informational, but also the really sophisticated adversaries understand that. So then when you do get hit, maybe they're using that. So it from a practitioner perspective, it can feel like it's just overwhelming. But that equation of risk equals, impact times likelihood. you just can't go away from that is our advice to folks. There's no better way to do it because you cannot boil the ocean. So let's stop being overwhelmed and just take one step at a time, do the best you can. Along those lines, we were talking about likelihood piece, but I'd love you to chat a little bit more about the impact piece, because not only do we know as practitioners that even the really well-funded organizations have trouble understanding what assets are of greatest impact, let alone what even assets they have. And so give a little bit, on that component, because that's the impact side of the risk equation when we look at the idea of tool set and how much time you spend. And some call it the crown jewels analysis, NIST, and our product use the term information system to sort of try to narrow in on a group of devices or assets that matter to the business, so you can sort of speak in different language. Because any even medium-sized organization, you're going to have so many assets, and software is included in an asset. Devices may be more limited, but it's just overwhelming very fast. So how do you look at that?
I think this is where the security team or the leader of the team really has a chance to make an impact for the organization in terms of connecting technology and technologists to the business folks and to understanding business risk. And at a smaller organization, that means the CISO or whoever that leader is needs to go talk to all of the business leaders. And this is getting on a Zoom, getting on a call, getting in an office, and just ask them, like, what are you concerned about in your area? And if you're the marketing department and all of a sudden the website's offline, how impactful is that to you? And they will know. Like, they may not know all of the components that drive the website, but they will know if the website's down, we're in trouble or we're not in trouble. They know. And so I get with the business leader to help me understand, well, what is the business risk that you're concerned about? And that helps me drive what assets are of value in that particular area. Now, I can go back then with the technology team, the IT folks, the engineers, and we can backtrace and figure out all of the components that make up that service that business leader is concerned with. I wouldn't expect the business leader to know all of the technical components, but they will generally know, like, in my area, I need this service, this service, this service, or else I'm really damaged. And they can also usually define what damage means. And I think what's key when you're looking at this risk formula is understanding the organization's appetite for risk. Because our goal here is not necessarily to drive risk to zero. We want to get risk to a place where that leader or that organization is comfortable. And that answer is different for different types of organizations. There are some organizations that must take risks in order to move forward. There are other conversations that are very stable and don't take a lot of risks. And so depending where you're at, and when you go talk to those business leaders, you want to ask them about their appetite for that risk at the same time that you're putting all this together.
Sure. I've got one more question, and we do have some questions in the chat. We'll sort of switch to that since we're going to turn off a bit early today at 2:45. So, one of the things we wanted to talk about here is these decisions on all the different silos. How important are they? And then, so you mentioned visibility. You mentioned the need for integrations, because every time you bring a tool in, if it doesn't integrate with others, it's tough. So when you make a decision on a tool, the value it provides in its own silo versus the maturity of the said company behind the tool, or how many integrations it has, how do you even begin that weighing that decision when you look at your security stack?
I think it's first and foremost, the problem that I have, is it a commodity problem? Is it already well addressed in the industry? Or is it something unique to my business because maybe we're doing something new, or our particular technology stack is a bit different? And really what I'm trying to ask myself there is, can I solve this problem with a commodity product? If there are 19 different email gateways, then I'm going to change my buying criteria to find one that that best fits within my tech stack and within my team's skill set. But if I'm on the cutting edge in a particular area where there's only 2 startups that have solved this problem, I'm going to focus less on their integrations and more on is my problem going to solve with this, and are the people behind the product going to work with me on new enhancements or problems that I have? Do I have some influence from a development side to get the product more mature and more tied to what I need to solve? And so that influences a lot of the buying criteria, just depending on what market the particular product is in, what silo, what problem that needs to be solved. It's not always going to be integrations at the top of the criteria. I've always got to consider integrations, and I've got to consider the internal cost to the team if I have a product that doesn't integrate well. Because now my staff has another console to check, another email to automate, another. I want to minimize that. The other thing that I don't know gets talked about enough is the relationship cost of every new product that I buy. Now I've got another relationship with fantastic folks like Thomas. I've got another executive relationship to maintain, and my calendar doesn't grow any, but I have another relationship that I've got to manage to make sure that I'm getting the best value out of the product, make sure that I can influence their roadmap. And so I've got to pay attention to those QBRs and the quarterly and the weekly check-ins and that kind of stuff, multiplied by number of critical vendors that I have. And do I have the time to keep up with all that?
Well, I have to admit, Jer, I've not heard that last one until you brought it up, and it's a very good point. And even though I'm on the vendor side, we clearly have relationships with subcontractors, et cetera, that does take time. So thank you for that. Thomas, you want to go to some Q&A? I'm trying to keep up on sort of first in, first out kind of idea. Do you want to take that, or you want me to pick a few?
No, absolutely. So Dan, JR, thank you so much for walking through everything today. As Dan mentioned, we have a bunch of questions from our chat. Everyone that's watching, we appreciate the participation. Feel free to keep adding them in. I'll kind of just start at the beginning here, and we'll work our way through. Dan, did you see one in particular? I'm going to start just with the first question.
Yeah, I think it's from Laura, if I'm seeing it correctly, on what are some emerging trends or threats in cybersecurity that defenders should be particularly vigilant about? Thank you for highlighting that. And from my perspective, JR, this goes into really what you were talking about on trying to understand the risk equation. So from a trend perspective, and I'd love to hear your take, but I would answer the question of be careful of the trends, because they may or may not actually matter to you. And what I see is these organizations, other CEOs that read something in the Wall Street Journal about this issue, and they sort of force their security team to tell me how we're doing this, and it's really irrelevant to their business, or the likelihood is so low because it's really focused on e-commerce businesses and you're a manufacturing company. So the first thing I would say is be careful of following the trends versus understanding your business and the threats in general that are most likely to impact your business. So how would you answer that, Jay?
Well, there's I don't know if Laura, if you're asking the question as a practitioner or as a security leader, but I'll tell you a lesson that I learned really early is to pay attention to the Wall Street Journal articles, and I will try to get in front of that CEO that wants to come ask how we're doing about it. So if I see something that's really interesting, I'll do a short write-up and I'll answer the question in advance: is this applicable to our organization or not? And if it is, here's what we're doing about it. Here's why I don't think it's a risk, or I do think it's a risk. And then I'll send that to the whole executive team, ideally within hours of the article coming out. And I find that keeps my phone quiet. So that's just a best practice at not really answering your question. But I will say, absolutely be careful of trends. To Dan's point, if you have visibility on your own organization, hopefully you're understanding and seeing what's key to your organization. If you have none of that, I would say think about account takeovers. Whether we've all seen in the last 6 to 12 months a lot of attention on Okta a lot of attention on Microsoft. So I would look at account takeovers. Are you doing all of the best practices in terms of how your organization's accounts are being managed? Because that's becoming the way that data gets transferred.
JR, you're spot on, and I appreciate you and Dan walking through that. I'm going to bump to the next question from Luke, and I'll just put it on the screen. He's basically looking how can defenders effectively prioritize security efforts to address the most critical vulnerabilities or risks?
So Luke, I think this one sometimes is different by organization. I'm reading into your question specifically, effectively prioritizing them. First, I would assume we've got them identified, and we've got some level of criteria to score them and identify what is critical. If you don't have that for your own organization, you can use common frameworks like CVSS, and then look at an exploitability score coming from the first.org organization if you have nothing else. And so you try to identify what is critical. And then to prioritize critical might come back to that risk equation. And even if you have a critical vulnerability in your organization, is it on a system that delivers a critical service for the business? Or is it on a system that's doing the cafeteria lunch menu, right? And so even if it's critical, it may not be a priority. And the only way sometimes to make that distinction is to spend time with your organizational leaders and have conversations with them about what drives risk and what causes the organization to miss its mission if something goes sideways.
JR, I agree with you completely. I think that's a very sound strategy. Luke did have a secondary part to his question. Dan, JR, kind of combination there. Basically what he's asking, as you can see, also, can you provide the insights into the role of artificial intelligence in machine learning and enhancing cybersecurity defenses?
Thomas, I'll go first here if you don't mind. We actually did one of our Empowered Defenders webinar with an AI expert, Alex Guimaraes. And this is, I think, a great question. A couple of things I'd say, and I'd love to hear the practitioner speak as well. First of all, when we think about generative AI and the promise that it has, and I think there's a lot of promise, it needs to be managed well and understand where its weaknesses are. And I believe that's the same with machine learning. And what JR mentioned earlier on anomaly detection, at the end of the day, that's, very AI solutions. So what are the behavior patterns of our executives? So I'm in DC right now. Again, sorry for the noise. I'm in a hotel. That wasn't planned for this, but I travel enough where me logging in from DC at 6 a.m. versus being in Seattle at whatever won't throw off an anomaly because the system has learned my patterns are sort of wider range than maybe Eric, who works in our Seattle office only. So those are very, very powerful. Having said that, those tend to come into the more mature organizations because the training, the tuning, the number of false positives can almost overwhelm you more than not having the data. And so you're chasing ghosts as opposed to really focusing on security. So a double-edged sword as well. Our type of, so Darklight uses a knowledge-driven AI, which is sort of the original, if you want to put it that, called expert systems. It's not really as sexy, but what it does is it takes information and then, for lack of a better word, is it makes if-then statements more scalable. So in the case of reviewing what threats may be more impactful to you as your organization, if you're an e-commerce type company, and we know that APT3, which is a Chinese named adversary, has 7 different campaigns that they're going against e-commerce infrastructure. An AI like ours ingests those campaigns, which we call adversary playbooks, and then we can proactively use that AI to review what's happening in the environment to pull out issues that may exist specific to you. And that's where, to me, the magic of AI for cybersecurity, which is still yet to be realized, is going to be a combination of the machine learning, which subset of AI, of course, knowledge driven, which is what we do, and the generative AI, which I think is going to save operators a huge amount of time. So So that's how I would answer that, and love to hear your additional take on that, JR.
I think the only thing I will add, and I've been using machine learning in cyber defense for probably a little over 10 years now. The only thing I would add is that AI and machine learning here are not taking jobs away from humans. And we're I think it will be a long time, maybe not in my career, where we see an AI effectively step in and take over the role of a security analyst. What it can do is make that analyst more effective, more knowledgeable, and be able to produce value with less experience. And that's something that we really need in the industry right now, because we're still underwater with having enough analysts to fill all the job openings.
And Thomas, we only got 4 minutes here, but I would love to try to get to Laura's question. I might have skipped over. Atari, if I'm saying that correctly, apologies on that one.
I'll pull that one up. And just to circle back on what both of you guys were saying, we recently went to the Cybersecurity Summit in Seattle, Dan and I, and that was exactly what they were saying. Obviously, AI is the hot talk track everywhere you go. But the premise that everyone was really getting to is AI is not going to take anybody's job in particular. It's going to be those individuals that aren't able to leverage AI, that aren't going to be as competitive in the workforce. So I like the way that you guys summed that up. Thank you for walking through that. Our next question, in the event of a cyber attack, what steps do you recommend organizations take to minimize damage and recover quickly?
So this is
yeah, go ahead, JR. It's a broad topic for 3 minutes, so
it's broad. I will say NIST has a fantastic document that walks through a computer security incident response team and function for CCERT. That if you should be able to find that with a quick search. That will walk through in detail, and sometimes painstaking detail, how to approach an incident response. And what steps to take to minimize and contain, and then ultimately resolve an incident.
Gentlemen, for sake of time, I appreciate you walking through that. Here's our last question that's on the board. Are there any regulatory or compliance considerations that defenders should be aware of in developing their cybersecurity strategies?
Almost certainly.
JR, you're best to answer that.
Almost certainly. It depends what regulatory environment that you're in. Monitoring employees in Europe is very different than monitoring employees in the United States. So you have to be aware somewhat of the labor laws, the privacy laws that affect the employees that are working at your organization. You also have to pay attention to what obligations that you may have with any reporting laws. And these are sometimes industry dependent. And obviously, very recently, the SEC requiring reporting for incidents on a publicly traded organization. So, including talking to all of your business leaders, you also need to be talking to the attorneys for your organization to make sure that everyone's on the same page with what to do there.
That's a great summary, and gentlemen, I know that was a very broad question, but I appreciate you both walking through that. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be closing out a little bit earlier than our normal sessions. JR, thank you so much for walking us through, for your time today. It's always great to lean on our partners and just the cybersecurity expertise that you bring to the table. So thank you for walking us through that. Dan, thank you as always. Everybody that's on the line, we will be making an announcement on LinkedIn to see whoever won. So please feel free and follow us there for the announcement as who won the $50 gift card from today. Also follow us on all these other socials. Additionally, please join us on April 10th at 2:00 Eastern for our next episode of The Empowered Defender. Gentlemen, before we close it out, I wanted to just say again, thank you both for joining, and I'll pass it to you to kind of close out from your side.
JR, please go first.
I really appreciate the opportunity, Thomas and Dan, to chat with you today, and for those folks that connected and asked questions in the chat. Really makes this more fun and engaging for us. So thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thanks,
echo those comments. Thomas and Kalia and team marketing of Broadlight, thanks for organizing. And JR, I know you're very busy with all these vendors you have to manage. So for you to take time out, and you're traveling as well, yet you didn't have the echo that I had for some reason, so I got to work on that. Really appreciate your time and appreciate the engaged audience. And some of these questions we'll get back to you guys directly on, but we are out of time. So again, much appreciated. Thomas, back to you.
Dan, thank you again. Everyone, as for joining today, everyone gets free access to our tool here at Darklight CIO. Feel free and drop us a note. My email is there, or you can just go ahead and hit our website and it'll get us the same information. You get 2 weeks free access to it. So feel free and drop us a note, and we'll love to get you guys up and running and taking a look at our tool here at CIO. Everyone, again, thank you for your time. JR, Dan, great session today. And tell your friends if they missed it, please follow us on YouTube. It'll be up in about 24 hours for anyone that wants to take a look at it later. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time here on the Empowered Defender. Bye-bye.